Welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I'm your host for this podcast. And today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome as my guest, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Lorraine Kochanske Stock, who has taught medieval literature, the Arthurian legend, the Robin Hood tradition, and cinematic adaptations of medieval topics in the English department of the University of Houston for the past 49 years. Her career-long research passions have included the medieval wild man and his female partner, the wild woman, and other medieval grotesque figures like Chalk Hill Giants, Sheela Na Gigs, the Foliate Face, aka Green Man, and medieval texts about wolfmen. She is revising a book about the wild man in the 12th, 13th century French culture and completing a book about the wild man in 14th through 16th century British culture. Recently, she has investigated several counterintuitive manifestations of the wild man, the motif of green-furred wild man in the material culture produced in 1490s Nuremberg, and the use of the wild man and wild woman in professional printers' marks, some of the most prominent early modern printers. She is very tuned into the visual arts and material culture of the medieval period, and she thinks in a former life she was, or a future one, she will be, an art historian. She has published extensively on these subjects and presents widely in a variety of conferences and contexts, and I would like to welcome you, Lorraine, to our podcast.
Very happy to be here and to help out my one of my oldest friends. So great to be here.
It is my pleasure and my honor. And one of the things that I absolutely love talking to you about is your research on wild men and women. And of course, Robin Hood and Green Men. But I'd like to give you a chance if you could just kind of give us an overview of your research interests and scholarship.
I got interested in the wild man in 1981. I attended an exhibition that was held by the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the Cloisters Museum on the wild man. I had never known anything about the wild man ever. Before that, I went to this exhibition, and as I was looking at everything at the exhibition, bells were going off in my head. Buzzers were buzzing in my heart. I just realized that this was something that I was passionately interested in. I was at the end of the run of the exhibition, in fact, so late in the exhibition that they ran out of catalogs. I couldn't even buy the catalog at that point. I did get one later on. But I just dived into that and became just crazy about it. It's something, it's become something that I've almost developed a radar about. If I'm in a museum and there are wild people on some piece of material culture, painting, whatever, I go, oh, there it is. And I've trained my son. My son went with me to Europe for 2 weeks this past summer so that I wouldn't die on the trip. He kept me alive. I don't feel confident at my age about traveling alone in Europe, and he was great to come along with me, and I've trained him very well. He finds these things sometimes before I do. You know, he came running back to me in the Germanische National Museum in Nuremberg and said, "Mom, I found a wild man that I don't think you know about." And I didn't. So
when you talk about wild men, though, what exactly do you mean? I mean, for a lot of modern audiences, they may not really have an idea in their head what constitutes a medieval wild person.
They do have an idea of the type of figure it is if they know anything about Bigfoot, for example, or Yeti, which are perhaps the American and Asian versions of, you know, the contemporary wild man for them, for those cultures. Every culture has their version of this figure. Sometimes they're not covered with fur, sometimes they're covered with feathers, sometimes they're covered with straw, sometimes they're covered with leaves, you know, and that's not necessarily the Foliate Face, aka Green Man, but
which
just
we will
a
talk
figure.
About later. Yes.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later, but every culture has their own idea of what this figure should be, and there's apparently a need for it, a psychological need for it. And so I just follow the trail of the wild man wherever it takes me. I find the figure fascinating because it combines humanity and an animal. I mean, the wild man, you'll have some pictures to show the audience later, but the wild man is completely covered head to toe in fur. He might look more like King Kong or the Bigfoot or
The
whatever,
Sasquatch idea. Yeah.
Sasquatch. Yeah,
Yeah.
he might look like that, except that he had a human face, and he had human hands that were not covered with fur, human feet that were not covered with fur, knees and elbows, the limbs, all the pointy parts of limbs were not covered with fur. The wild woman who was his partner, the wild woman was completely covered with fur except for her breasts. So she had exposed breasts that peeked out of the fur, I guess seductively. I guess it was supposed to be seductive.
As you
And
do.
their role, they lived in the forest. They were mythical creatures. I mean, people, I think, believed they were quote unquote out there in the forest somewhere. Many of the medieval romances, the chivalric romances, have the medieval knights encountering figures that are either uh, bona fide wild men or are wild man-like figures or giants that have some of the features of wild men. So, the writers in the Middle Ages thought that they were out there, and they addressed, they delivered to the audience something that I think the audience was expecting, that it would be out there too. And it just it combines, it's how humans identify with the animal within them,
Interesting.
perhaps.
Okay.
I mean, we all, born to be wild, or you could,
Right.
play any kind of background music right now. Wild Thing.
Wild thing. Okay.
Everybody on some level has a little bit of wild in them. In the 90s, there were books that, about tapping into the wild man within you by Robert Bly. Women Who Run with the Wolves, women were supposed to tap into the wild woman inside of them. It goes in phases, just as with the Green Man. There are phases where, you go to every garden center and there will be Green Man plaques on the wall that you can buy and put on your garden fence. But the wild man he was ferocious. I mean, he wasn't a nice little teddy bear.
Okay, because
He was,
that's kind of my next question
yes,
is that
okay.
what are the characteristics besides the physical that distinguishes a wild man from anything else?
Okay. He is ferociously violent. He does not usually use the kinds of manufactured weapon, except later. We can talk about that later. But in the early, the sort of traditional, if you will, wild man has uh, no, swords or spears or those kinds of manufactured human weapons. He uses as his weapon either a club or an uprooted tree. And the fact that he is wielding an uprooted tree in his hand indicates tremendous strength. He also had tremendous
Size.
size.
I was
They
gonna say
were,
the
sometimes
size.
associated, they were sometimes, mixed up, could be, equally identified as giants. Some giants are wild men. Some of the characters in French medieval romances, like Chrétien's Ivan, the so-called wild herdsman, who was really called in the French a vilain, or a lower class person, not a herdsman or a wild herdsman or anything that the translators call him. But he's 17 feet tall and he is a wild man figure. So, they were big. They were big. They were ferocious. They were also sexy. I mean, very hypersexual. Um, they were noted for that, which is one of the reasons I think that eventually civilized people adopted the wild man as a bearer or a symbol on their heraldry, because the heraldry is about family and generations and, keeping the family line intact and all that. And it's about fertility, keeping the family line going. You have to do that by continuing to uh,
Procreate.
procreate. And the wild man on a heraldic shield, or holding up the heraldic crest or whatever, was a symbol of that generational
Virility.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, virility for sure.
Yeah.
Though, interestingly, even though the wild man is supposed to be this hypersexual creature who went around raping and pillaging on human women, I I've probably looked at, oh, I don't know, thousands of images of wild men over the years since 1981, and I can probably count on one and a half hands how many of them actually show a penis.
Right. No
Um,
genitalia.
no genitalia, even though, genitalia you would think would be the obvious signifier of their virility,
Right.
but very, very few of them actually show that. It's always either they have their hand over it discreetly or whatever. Um, so yes, that's another part of it. They're very, they're hypersexual, they're violent. Um, they're supposedly vegetarians, although I don't know. I mean, they were supposed to live off the land, roots and berries and, all that good stuff. They lived in caves. They were the opposite. They were a symbol of primitivism because they were the opposite of everything that civilization stood for. And I honestly think that one of the reasons there are so many wild men in European medieval imagery, and they're everywhere. They're in manuscripts, they're on sculptures in churches, they're wooden carved misericords, they're, you name it, they're there. And I think one of the reasons they're so prolifically represented is that everybody identified with them. They wanted to be like the wild man for various reasons, maybe to be more virile or to be more strong or to be bigger or, all of those things. And the wild man then became this ubiquitous figure that you find in so many places, sometimes in strange places that you don't expect him. But it became, and sometimes associated with figures that you wouldn't have expected. For example, in the 1390 Wenceslas Bible, which is this fabulous medieval manuscript, it is one of the most gorgeous manuscripts I've ever seen, and it was made for Emperor Wenceslas IV, who was the king of Bohemia and the uh, German emperor. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. He had all of these various titles that he held, and he was somewhat of a slouch as a king. He wasn't very effective. And so, this Bible that was made for him and presented to him, all over the place in that Bible, you see representations of Wenceslas with wild men or being surrounded by wild men or in the costume of a wild man himself, wearing his own heraldic regalia that indicates who he is, and
Right.
yet he's covered with fur. So, you don't expect a king to be associated with the wild man, and yet this very prominent emperor was.
Is this the
In
good King Wenceslas of Christmas
no,
music?
no.
Okay.
Good King Wenceslas was his ancestor. There
Okay.
were a series of Wenceslases in Czech history,
Because that
and
would have an interesting correspondence with good
yeah,
King Wenceslas of Christmas and Krampus, but
yeah. But no, I don't. Well, maybe I
yeah,
don't think so.
but yeah, no, different
Yeah,
Wenceslas. That's cool.
different Wenceslas. Yeah, different times, different Wenceslas. So you don't expect to see kings associated with wild men, and yet you do. So those are the little surprises. One of the most recent things that I've been investigating is how early modern printers, really some of the most prominent ones on the continent, and then later on in Great Britain, they chose wild people, either a wild man by himself or a wild man and a wild woman flanking a tree looking kind of like Adam and Eve. They used that as their printer's mark, which was their business card, their personal, professional identifier. It was a little bit like heraldry, but
Right.
it was professional, not genealogical. And so, to me, it's so it's counterintuitive that the people who in the 1490s, these people were the Steve Jobses of their
Right.
time. They
Because this is
were
technology. This
cutting
is cutting
edge
edge technology.
technology.
Yeah.
And to me, it's counterintuitive that someone who is employing cutting edge technology would choose this retrograde figure as their representation for their professional model.
Especially
So,
since the technology is a mark of
yeah,
civilization,
I
and of
mean,
course the green man's the opposite of that.
think about whether, we know Steve Jobs chose an apple for his logo. Would you be surprised? I think you would if Steve Jobs had chosen Bigfoot as his logo for the company that he founded,
Yeah.
which became Apple because he chose an apple. But um, what if he made Bigfoot computers? That's the equivalent of what we're talking about with these printers. It just boggles my mind that they would do this. And it isn't just one or two. I keep finding more and more. And then when some of the prominent printers in Paris adopted the wild man and woman, or just the wild man in Germany too, actually all over Europe, for that matter, if they adopted the wild man, and these would be woodcuts that would be, almost like a little book plate that would be in the inside front pages of the book that they published, and it would essentially also be their copyright. Other printers would then copy those
Right. So much for copyright.
and
Everyone's
pirate
going to copy it.
pirate the
Yeah.
books by imitating their
Printer's
printer's
mark.
mark.
Yeah.
And they did, in Scotland, some of the printers in Scotland adopted the wild man, and they look like dead ringers for the ones on the continent. So, that's something that I didn't expect. It just takes you in directions that you think you understand the figure, and then you realize, well, no, I don't understand it completely, and
Well, I
there's
mean, one
more
of the
to it than
interesting
that.
things about the wild men and the way that you've characterized them, of course, since obviously they can be identified mostly by their fur at first
Yeah,
glance, especially if it's just an illustration or a statue or a figure. Because in medieval texts like the alliterative Morte d'Arthur or even in Geoffrey of Monmouth, you've got giants, and the
yeah,
giants are nasty business too. I mean, the
yes,
giant of Mont Saint Michel rapes women to death,
yes,
eats
yes,
children.
yes,
He's huge, he's
yes,
corpulent, he
yeah,
but King Arthur is still able to fight him in hand-to-hand combat,
yeah.
castrate him, and kill
Mhm.
him. But he wears a cloak of beards. Do you see those kind of connections transferring into the wild man figure, or are giants just a completely separate breed in medieval literary texts?
I think they are both a separate breed, and also there are some crossovers. I think giant figures, the one I most recently just published an article about the Cernabis giant, which is this huge chalk figure, inscribed in the earth, in Dorset in England. And it is, I forget now the dimensions, but it's a naked giant figure carrying this big club,
With a
and it
massive
has
wig.
a like a 21-foot long penis
Yeah.
erect. And
Yeah.
and I consider that a near relative of the wild man
Okay.
because of the club. There are certain signifiers that the wild man became identified with, including the club, the tree, if it was the uprooted tree that he was
Well,
wielding and
and if
waving
you think
around.
about it, he's on a hillside, is he
He's
not?
on a hillside, yes.
And so, but there's also grass. So his
Yes.
body is filled in
His
essentially with
body is green.
green fur.
Yeah, the the sad story is that I got a grant to go to England to photograph Big Willie, as I called him,
That's fair.
and that summer they had a drought, and there was no green grass. It was
Oh
all kind of
no.
beige. It was harder to see the white outline against beige than it would have been against,
But it's,
bright
beige
green.
fur then in that case,
Yeah, yeah.
but
But I consider that a wild man figure. He's
uh-huh.
not covered with fur, but I think he has some resemblance to the wild man. And we don't know exactly what the original creators of the CERN giant, intended him to signify.
Right.
But, you know, obviously he's a huge figure. He's a, scary big figure. And so they wanted him to mean something. And I was really gratified recently that the CERN giant has been dated variously to prehistory, from prehistory to the 19th century. And I always wanted it to be medieval, and I couldn't prove it.
Right?
But
I mean,
two
that's the
years ago,
thing. Yeah.
an article was published where they did archaeological investigation of him, and he can now be firmly dated to the 10th century, which means that Geoffrey of Monmouth could have known the CERN giant
Right.
and been tapping into the lore about the giant when he wrote his foundation myth for Britain, which is about killing giants.
Right. And of course involves eventually again, like the giant of Mont Saint Michel
Yeah,
starts in
yeah,
Geoffrey of Monmouth, and ends up in the other Arthurian stories as
right.
part of that. And of course, if you think about the fact that it's the giant of Mont Saint Michel, it's interesting because by the time Geoffrey is writing that in the 12th century, you have a monastic settlement, a
Yeah.
monastic community on Mont Saint Michel. It's like, but here he is saying, no, it's populated by this big, nasty, cannibalistic,
Well,
rapist.
there was a monastic community in Cerne Abbas too. The abbess in Cerne Abbas is about
Right,
the abbey there.
right.
Yeah.
And so it's
So,
interesting that
yeah,
there's this idea of, okay, we conquered a giant and that made it habitable,
yeah,
perhaps,
yeah,
for those Christian communities,
yeah.
because of course the Arthurian tradition is set much
Yes.
earlier in actual quote unquote historic time.
And the people who originally cut those figures, and then those, grass grows,
Yeah.
and those figures had to be constantly kept up and
Yeah.
scoured so that the outline would show up.
For
And
centuries.
that was done over centuries. And
Yeah.
that means that those people, it meant something to the community to put in the effort, to put in what was grunt work, to try to keep this thing alive, not alive, but
Yeah.
visually
To keep it
alive on the
there and to
hill. Yeah,
preserve it
so
in
that
the
it could be
hill.
seen from
Yeah.
space, even. That's how big it is. You can see it from outer space. So, yes, I mean, it meant a lot to the original communities there, and they kept it up. Not all of the chalk figures were kept up. There were chalk figures of Gog and Magog in Plymouth that were there in the earlier Middle Ages. That's part of my article too. And they eventually stopped, scouring them out, and they grew back into the underbrush or
Interesting. So they were
whatever.
kind of reabsorbed into the
And the
landscape.
community, though, in Plymouth is so excited about that history that they recently redid them, and they have the figures there. Now they're not scoured into the earth. That's too time consuming and labor intensive. They have them painted on the grass, but
Oh,
they put the figures back there, and that shows that it still means something to that community. They wanted to revive that tradition. Yeah.
well, and what's interesting because the wild men that you have found on your travels and in your research,
Yeah.
in some respects, in the medieval manuscripts, there are some interactions with the wild men and, of course, the figures of civilization. There are actually some manuscripts that show wild men coming to court, are there
Yes.
not? And
Yes.
kind of performing.
Yes. And in the later medieval period, that's where I start seeing the wild man being tamed, if you will. What they do is the artists will clothe the wild, and you can see the fur, it's still a wild man, but they'll clothe them with the latest 15th century fashion. There's a tapestry in the Chateau de Saumur in France that shows, like, I forget, there are about 50 figures of wild people, and you can't tell whether the civilized people are dressing up as wild people or vice versa, because they're all wearing these wonderful fashions, but
And
they
they're all
all have
covered in
fur.
fur.
Yeah, and no, it's just an amazing confluence of civilization and wildness, coming together. It almost looks like an al fresco picnic. They're all out there in the woods having a great old time. And, what does that mean? It means that people want to embrace that wildness or tame it. They may want to tame it.
Now, of course, the wild man as a humanoid figure that walks on all fours, and do the wild men have language in the texts?
N- Not most of the time.
Okay.
One of the one of the character kind of classic characteristics of wild men, in addition to all the other things that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, is that they're supposed to suffer from aphasia. They're supposed to not be able to speak. Now, that makes them unlikely figures in literary works where everything is about talking and
Right.
speech. And occasionally, so I consider some figures, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, that figure in Chrétien's Ivan, who is the 17-foot Vilan, but he is, I consider him a wild man figure because he talks, and he does talk surprisingly, and he actually speaks and makes more sense than the civilized figures do. So Arthur and all of the rest of them, Ivan and everybody else who come, they're all idiots compared to him. I mean, he just got his head together in a way that they don't, which I find, really amusing.
And an
And
interesting commentary on the chivalric
it
court.
is. No, no, it is. And I think a lot of times the wild man was used as a commentary on civilization, because civilization sucks
Yeah,
sometimes.
well, and
Yeah.
civilization kind of sucks a lot at the moment too. So
Yes.
that is fair.
That is, yeah.
But with the wild men and the idea that they are possibly being tamed, do you think the quote unquote taming of the wild men represents kind of a I don't know, like an adaptation of, all right, these are previously wild, we're bringing them in, but we're still going to emulate them ourselves? Does that kind of then completely blur the lines between the quote civilized Christian medieval Europe and the very rapidly disappearing at that point landscape?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I mean, I think it's a yearning to be back there. The wild man is he's an origin figure. There are a lot of wild men and women, pairs together that are dead ringers for Adam and Eve. They look like Adam, the way they're posed. At
Right.
first glance, you think, "Oh, that's Adam and Eve," and then you realize, "Oh, wait,
They're
Adam and
covered
Eve
in
are
fur.
wearing fur." Yeah, and that there's a roof boss that shows supposedly Adam and Eve, and they're completely covered in fur. And Adam is holding a piece of fruit, like, giving
Yeah.
it to Eve. And yet they are completely, they're Aborigines, which is from the root of what it means, from the origin. And wild people are Aboriginals too, and so are Adam and Eve. And so some wild people and Adam and Eve are virtually indistinguishable from each other.
Which is interesting because if you
Yeah.
consider some of the saints' lives, like the images of Mary Magdalene, and,
Mary of Egypt.
um, with her hair, and
Yes,
there are images of
covered by
Mary
hair.
Magdalene where she looks like cousin It from the Addams family.
Well, I consider that a kind of adaptation of the Wild Woman, yeah.
Yeah,
And
because
Mary of Egypt, the same.
exactly, because Mary of
Yeah,
Egypt, of course, is essentially a hermit. She's
yeah,
in the forest,
yeah.
or sorry, not the forest, in the desert
In the
as
desert.
kind of her penance and her
But that's true
sanctity
of
is
Mary
tied to
Magdalene
that.
too. When
Yeah.
she was the Wild Woman, she was out in the desert and she was, isolated from, and that also taps into the wild man being isolated from the civilized court and being out there in the woods. He didn't live in a habitation that was man-made. He lived in caves or under tree trunks or in tree trunks or whatever. It's always a natural habitat rather than a manufactured edifice, some building that, people created.
Yeah, and that people would have populated. And yet
Yeah,
they're in all of these manuscripts. And you said that when you were
yeah,
in Nuremberg, you sent me pictures on these extraordinary statues. And especially as you get into the later Middle Ages, they seem to have much more detailed exhibits of the wild men. Do they
yes.
not?
And
Yeah.
in some of the most exquisite uh, materials. So it's not in Nuremberg, it's right now in the cloisters in New York, but there are a pair of gold ewers that are, magnificent. They're like this high and they're totally ornamental. I mean, they're not functional in any way, shape, or form. And those ewers are topped by finials that are gorgeously painted, enameled, green furred wild men.
Green furred.
Each little wild man who is a finial on the top of the of this the you know the this beaker, whatever you want to call it, is a giant ewer that would, I guess it's supposed to contain some sort of liquid, but would never be used for that because it was too ornamental. And the finial, the topping, the cherry on the top of the sundae of that beautiful artifact is a green furred, enameled, gorgeous little wild man on both of them. There's two different wild men. And the green, I saw that, and then I was in Nuremberg another time, and in one of the churches in the Lawrence Church, I saw some stained glass that showed a wild man who had bright emerald, like my shirt, emerald
Yeah.
green fur. And okay, there's two of them. And once you have two of them, it becomes a collection. And
Right.
then I started finding more and more. Albrecht Dürer, several of his paintings, they have heraldic wild men that are green furred. Why? And all of this stuff is happening at exactly the same decade in 1490s, the 1490s in Nuremberg. Not anywhere else, just Nuremberg.
And it's fur, not leaves.
Oh, it's fur. No,
Yeah.
definitely
Okay.
fur. I mean, this is a wild man, not some sort of, variation
Of
of
Adam and Eve
Napoleon.
and leaf colored,
Yeah,
the
no,
leaf
no. This is
foliate
fur. You can
clothing.
tell
Yeah.
on the little finials, it's fur. It's green fur, but gorgeous, bright green fur, and it's made out of gold, and and there are some other things like that that are made, fabricated out of luxury materials for a luxury audience and consumer. And yet, you wouldn't think that the luxury consumer would want to put a wild man on the top of that thing that
Right.
probably cost a year's salary, but they did. And that's what I'm trying to puzzle my way through why they did that.
Is that kind of the exotic element of, here is like finding something on your far-flung travels, like the cabinet of curiosities,
Yeah.
and oh, our curiosity is a wild man, and so we're putting it on this
I
fantastic
think
art
it would be a
piece.
curiosity if there were one, but there are many of them in Nuremberg. So I'm trying to puzzle my way through explaining why this happened at that particular moment in time in that particular place. Nuremberg was sort of the artisan capital of Europe at that time. I mean, every printers, the Nuremberg Bible, not Nuremberg Bible, the Nuremberg Chronicle was published in exactly that decade. And it too has wild men on the frontispiece page. And if you were buying one of these very expensive printed books, you could put, each of the wild men at the bottom of the page was holding a blank heraldic shield. And you could have your heraldry painted on the shield,
Oh
which would
wow.
be like having your own book plate held by a wild man.
Right.
So
So
it
it's
would
basically
indicate that's how it indicated you bought that book because
right.
your herald, yeah, but it would be a wild man holding the heraldry. And the wild men are in the lower corners of the page beneath God the creator who's in a throne and, you know,
Yeah.
wild men, God the creator. Why?
Well, I mean, if you
Why?
can, if
But
you can,
and then what I was going to say is those little wild men in the lower corners. I mean, a book is printed in black ink on white paper or cream colored paper, so you wouldn't know the color of the fur. But then there were deluxe versions of the Nuremberg Chronicle that could be bought that would be hand colored, and in some of them, not all of them, but in enough of them that I've seen, the fur on that wild man in the lower corners would be painted green, not brown. So
interesting.
go figure. There
And
again,
and
it's
and
it's it's origin. It's sourced in Nuremberg, and it's
I was gonna say, and
made
so
in
it's
that same
specifically
decade
Nuremberg.
when.
Yeah, you've not seen green furred wild men
Yes,
anywhere
yes,
else.
no, 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 no,
That's
because it's
fascinating.
such an unusual thing. All
Yeah.
the other wild men I've seen that had in color, let's put it that way, or have had either brown fur or occasionally gray fur. But the brown fur is to indicate their animalness, because
Right.
animals have, usually animals,
Yeah.
bears or, other upright animals have brown fur. And so to see one with green fur, well, first of all, it's artificial. It's not natural,
Right.
right?
Right.
I mean,
And
we don't have any animals that have green fur,
no, no,
right?
no, no, not
So
at
it's
all.
utter artifice, utter artifice. And
Right.
so, you have this weird juxtaposition of the naturalness of the wild man itself and the artifice of green fur. And, you know,
Yeah,
so
that I mean that's it's fascinating. And when I'm leading that Great Courses Journeys tour to Germany in May, shout out for that if anybody wants to sign up. Um, we are going to Nuremberg. So I will be able to take live video of those green men because I have made a point of telling them that we've got to go see that. So we'll go see whatever we can of the green men in Nuremberg when we're there.
fabulous medieval churches in Nuremberg that you could spend the entire day in one of them,
Yeah, we're
and you
supposed to
won't
go
have
to the
time to do
castle,
that.
but I'm going to make sure we can go
Yeah,
to some of the churches
but
too.
they're amazing churches. And then there's an amazing museum. The Germanische National Museum is there, and that has a vast collection of medieval artifacts, and paintings and and tapestries. And there's the other thing. Okay, I found a lot of tapestries, and that's another kind of material culture artifact that is extremely labor intensive, extremely expensive. Who could afford to have a tapestry woven for their own personal use? And you'd have to be extremely rich. You'd carry those tapestries around with you wherever you travel to your various chateaux or your castles or whatever, and you would put them on the wall both as decoration and also as insulation. But they were expensive. They were hugely expensive. Now, if you were going to commission a series of tapestries to be fabricated, would you make a tapestry that had humans interacting with
With
wild
wild
men?
men. Yeah.
Or wild men farming, or wild men doing whatever they were doing, or wild men subduing various kinds of mythical beasts. Though there are many tapestries that are like that have wild men doing various and sundry things that people had to commission and spend a tremendous amount of money for. And you wonder why. They could have had courtly scenes of Arthurian life, or, any of that other
Unicorns.
kind of stuff.
They could
Yeah.
have had more unicorns. That, yeah.
Unicorns, yeah, the
Unicorns, yeah.
unicorn tapestry. I was just in Paris a few weeks ago and saw the lady with the unicorn tapestries in the
In
Musée du Louvre.
Cluny.
They're
Yeah.
wonderful.
I love
And
those.
that series also would have cost the earth, to create, and it doesn't have wild people in it. But then there are other series that have wild people, and you wonder why would they commission that?
But no, in those tapestries, you said the wild men are farming or subduing animals. I mean, that's all actions of civilization. So in those
Well,
tapestries,
subduing animals, not so much.
okay, but the farming,
Yeah, and there's again, that's where I consider the civilization trying to co-opt the wild man so that, they become even more enmeshed in their interactions and their interstices.
now, and of course, so I know that people are going to sit here and say, well, Greenford wild men, so green men. But green men are not wild men, and green men, foliate faces. Could you explain the difference between what people think of as green men
Sure,
and foliate faces?
sure. And I will tell you, I won't name names, but
Probably a good idea.
I know several really world well-known medievalists who think that they're the same thing. I'll tell you them later. I'll
Yeah,
tell
tell
you
me
who it
later.
is
That's
later.
fine. We
But
can
they
stick
don't
that behind the
realize there's a
paywall.
difference.
Yeah,
They just treat them as if they're the same.
but they're
Um, no,
not.
they're not at all. And so I did find a couple of places in the 16th century in some of the descriptions of, everyday life, things that happened in London, and Lord Mayor's shows that would have whifflers that were supposedly wild men. They often used wild men as whifflers at these parades and, Lord Mayor's shows and all that sort of thing. But in one particular case, and I'm not remembering off the top of my head which one this was, it might have been Stowe. He calls those whifflers green men. Now they weren't foliate face human,
Right.
woo. They were wild men that for some reason or other he called green men. But I don't really think that they were full of leaves. They were they were
Right.
whifflers who were wild men because they were bearing clubs and doing all kinds
So
of
when you
mayhem.
think when you think of green men, of course, it's more the association with the foliate aspect, the
Yes,
leaves. Because I mean,
leaves.
even in
Yes.
modern popular culture, like the Maryland Renaissance Festival, there is a Green Man March, but it's leaves. These are not meant to
Yeah.
be wild
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
These are meant to be green men, and they
Yeah.
march every
But
year in
most of the
December.
green men I would say again, the only exceptions that I can think of on one hand, the fingers of one hand, that show a foliate face attached to a human body. There are a few, not very many. Um, Most of the time, all you see is the face, and the face will often be disgorging greenery of some sort or other from their mouth, from various orifices of their face. Sometimes, and these can be quite scary. They can be coming out of their eyes, they can be coming out of their nose. Greenery emitted from their eardrums, and their mouth, of course, is the most common.
Yeah.
But they vary a lot in whether you could consider them beneficent figures or benevolent figures versus scary figures. Some of them are downright scary looking. And the other question I always think of when I look at these is most scholars who talk about the so-called green man or foliate face, they assume that the green man is disgorging the greenery out of their mouth, and that is the eternal, the return of springtime and all that other good stuff. How do we know they're disgorging out of their mouth and not sucking the greenery into their mouth?
Like they're
In
being
which case,
subsumed by the greenery itself. Like the greenery is
yeah, that they're
kind of
sucking in the greenery and
right.
taking the greenery away from us instead of giving it to us. It's hard to tell. Are they emitting it or are they consuming the greenery?
I hadn't even thought about that. I mean, for all the green men that I've seen and
Yeah,
all the research that I've done on green men, including reading everything you've ever written on it,
yeah. Well,
it's never occurred to me that maybe it's going the other direction. And perhaps that represents in some way the body returning to nature as
yes,
opposed to being reborn. Maybe it's the process of
yes,
decay.
yes, yes. And some very bad movie adaptations of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight kind of go there.
I was going to bring it up because, I mean, at the end of the day, both of us, you and I both, are huge fans of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And the text itself, we've taught it, we've written about it. And of course, everybody, again, you've got a Green Knight. And there is this transposition, warranted or not, on the Green Knight and Green Men. So,
And
Sir Gawain
sometimes
and the Green
Wild Man.
Knight.
Sometimes the Wild Man, too. I mean, there are some scholars who have called him some combination thereof of
But
Wild
he
Man and
doesn't
Green
have
Man.
fur.
Well,
Now I
I'm
know.
just
And
reporting. I'm not
the thing
endorsing.
about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and for the audience who hasn't been introduced to this text yet, it is a very famous 14th century Arthurian text that survives in one singular copy, though there are analogs of this text in other collections and other stories. And there will be a whole episode on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I promise you, my audience, I promise you, because this is one of my favorite texts ever. It is an alliterative Middle English romance that is extraordinary in its discussions of courtly life and hunting and just the entire interplay of courtly ideals. And the Green Man, a lot of people will say, well, he's horrible and he's there he's there for violence. I'm sorry, he's dressed better than anybody at the Arthurian court. And he says
Yeah,
he's not there for a fight.
yeah, he's a fashion plate. He's not dressed in armor, whereas Gawain arms himself for Bear, to go and meet him, even though, he's supposed to be on even terms with him when he meets him
Right?
again. And he kind of cheats at the game by arming himself. And he was, the Green Knight wasn't armed at all when they had their little contretemps in the court in Fit One. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, the Green Knight says, because Arthur's like, well, anybody here will happily fight you. And the Green Man's like, I'm not here for that. And he's like, but no, we'll fight you. And
Yeah.
he's like, I'm not here for that. But we'll fight. Listen, We're not here for that. That's not why we're here. So, why do you think that people want to read specifically the Green Knight and Sir Gawain the Green Knight as some kind of variation of the Green Men? Because there are plenty of knights in Arthurian literature who take on green armor. I mean, that happens all the time. People dress in the red armor, the green armor, the black armor. Why do you think it is that with Sir
Well, in
Gawain the
this
Green Knight?
particular case, it's only green armor. It's very spectacular green, not armor, green clothing, green
He's green,
clothing,
entirely green.
green clothing, and
He's
green
fucking green.
skin, and green
Yes.
skin. He's,
Yes.
he's green everywhere, top to toe. His
Except his
clothing is
eyes.
green, and he's clothed in garments that are a combination of sort of nature color, if not, nature, velvet and all that good satin and all that great
Yeah.
stuff.
With
Silk.
gold
It's not.
embroidery. He's got gold embroidery
Yeah.
of
No, I was going to say
vine.
the gold. So you
Yeah.
have this clash of nature and civilization in the green and the gold. And so I think it's kind of a no-brainer that people would leap to the conclusion that on some level you should associate him with the Green Man. And some of the movie adapters have done that and have made him into a tree man or, whatever, or, this big
Groot.
figure with veins and leaves and
Yeah.
you know and it's an adaptation and it's an interpretation, so
Yeah. I mean,
every adaptation is its own thing according to Linda Hutchin.
well, and I
So
mean, anytime I teach Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I have to explain. It's like the poet goes into exquisite detail
yeah.
about the fact that he is green. He's entirely green. All of him is green. He is fucking green. And if you think cutting off his head is going to end that contest at that moment, you're an idiot because he's fucking green. You should know better. But Green Man, is it just because his skin is green, because his armor is green, but is it also in any way because there's so much forestry in that poem as well? And
Yes, there is.
yeah,
Yes, there is. And that, that certainly contributes to it. And that also is the jumping off point for some of the, like David Lowery's Green Knight, a movie, goes into all this. There's a whole big speech by Lady Bertilac about, green, what greenness means. And that's much more of a modern interpretation of ecology rather than maybe what they would have thought about in the 14th century. Um, but the greenness is significant. I mean, I know there are other colored knights in other romances, but in this particular romance, the only knight who has a color associated with him is the Green Knight, and that has to be significant.
well, and he
So,
explains that he's
and he's,
transformed through
he,
magic, the magic of Morgan Le Fay, because
yes,
he's
yes,
Bertilac
yes, yes,
until she transforms him into the Green Knight,
yeah,
and when
right,
Gawain
right,
meets him, he's in a barrow. I mean, he's essentially in the Green Chapel, which is this natural place that is
yes.
possibly akin to those barrows
It's
of
no
the
but an old cave. It's nothing but an old cave.
right.
And there again, that's one of the reasons why I think you could say that some scholars, Larry Benson, famously identified the Green Knight with the Wild Man because of the habitation, the cave, and that's where the Wild Man lived. And okay, let me just say something about green men, the green foliate face person. The other thing about that is that name was given to that figure by Lady Raglan in I think the early 20th century or the late 19th century, I can't remember, but way past the Middle Ages. I mean, this is a way post-medieval interpretation of that figure. So most of the so-called green men that you see in the various media that artists created are not colored green. Most of them are in stone and therefore are gray. A lot of them are in wood. They're misericords. They're brown because the wood is brown. And they're not painted. Now, I'm not going to say there aren't some stained glass windows that might have a green man and the, color might be green. But the association of those foliate faces with green
Right.
came with Lady Raglan's tagging that name onto them, which stuck and unfortunately forever stuck. And people call that figure the Green Man rather than the Foliate Face because she
Well,
gave it that name.
But because so many of those images are in churches, and we have evidence that so many of the churches might have been painted in the Middle Ages, that what we get is now is gray stone. But
Yes.
if you're in
Yeah, but
Brussels or
usually you can
Bruges,
find traces of the polychrome. And I
yeah.
don't think in most of these they're on capitals and things that, well, I don't know. We'll never
Well,
know.
I mean, and that is one of the things when you because yes, there'd be traces of the
Yeah.
polychrome, perhaps if they go look
Yeah.
for them. Um, and some of course, is restoration work from the 19th century anyway. But I mean, that's an interesting question because if you're at the Basilica of the Holy Blood in Bruges, all that stonework is painted. All of those medieval churches, they did an experiment in
Yeah.
Schaft where
Yeah.
they painted part of
Yeah.
Schaft because they found the records for the paint. So I mean, it's possible at some point they were painted, but regardless, when Lady Raglan saw them, they weren't. So, and we don't see them that way now.
Yeah.
And yet she
Yeah. And
called
she
them,
just put the tag Green Man on them because most of the time, what is coming out of their mouths or eyes or ears or whatever is greenery.
right.
So therefore, and the interest, this figure has been adopted in so many ways up until like almost a year. Coronation was 2 years ago. I'm losing track of time. But the coronation of King Charles, the invitation to the coronation had it was very kind of pseudo medieval looking, and it had all kinds of flowers and foliage in the margins of the center was where the words of the invitation were, and at the very all of that foliage and flowery stuff led to the bottom center, which was a foliate face green man. So even King Charles, or whoever chose that design for his invitation, he was employing the green man. He's very interested in, I mean, Charles is interested in ecology, so maybe that was a nod toward that and the green man's association with ecology. I don't know, but
Yeah.
it's right up to like a year ago. It's still being very popular.
But
Yeah,
as we've mentioned
in
before,
something as prominent as a coronation
right. And we don't have coronations all
invitation.
that often.
That's
So, yeah.
that's big time.
Yeah. Well, and because so many of the foliate faces, as they're called, are in churches, why is it, do you think, that, especially in modern popular culture, the green man is thus associated with non-Christian religious traditions, and yet most of them appear in churches?
Many of them do, and many of them don't. I was really surprised, and there are so many of them in so many places. They're everywhere. I was for the first time in my life. I've been to Europe, continental Europe, and England many times. I'd never been to Poland, and a few weeks ago I went to Poland to a conference, and the Kochanske in my name, cried out to go to Poland, and I found green men, so-called green men, in secular architecture in Poland as well as in church architecture. So, and I wasn't looking for, or expecting to find green men in Poland. For some reason, I just didn't
Oh,
think
it's
that
associated
that
with
motif
England.
had
Yeah.
traveled that far east.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
'Cause
They were ubiquitous.
Which is interesting because it is something that is often associated with the folklore of England,
Yeah,
Wales, a lesser
yeah.
extent Ireland, because I've never seen any actual foliate faces in Ireland. Sheela Na Gigs, which is another thing altogether, but not
I
foliate
think I
faces.
think there are some. I think there are some, but not as many as you find in England or the continent. No, that's
Yeah.
true.
And so,
Yeah.
of course, since I mentioned it, our favorite female figure of stonework, the Sheela Na Gig. So can you go ahead and give us kind of an interesting
Well,
overview of the Sheela Na
Sheila,
Gig?
I have a funny anecdote about that. I'm trying to remember when I got interested in Sheila Na Gigs. I can date to the day when I got interested in wild men. But I think I got interested in Sheila Na Gigs when I knew I was going to be going to Dublin for a New Chaucer Society conference back in I guess it was the late 80s or the early 90s. And I had vaguely heard about Sheila Na Gigs in Ireland, and I thought, well, I'm going to go to Ireland. Let me go there and look for them and find them. So, and I did. We spent, I think our whole itinerary of our journey in Ireland was centered around looking to places that had supposedly had Sheela Na Gigs. I had a gazetteer of Sheela Na Gigs, and we followed the gazetteer to look for them wherever they were supposed to be. And my son was then, he's now 42. He was then about 9, I want to say. And they're hard to see when they're in situ. They're often in a stone wall where they just fade in to the rest of and they're not as big as you think they might be compared to, you might see them in pictures and they look like they're bigger than they are. Like the one, there it is.
I've
But the
seen
famous one is actually so small. The one that is on the cover of everything is, and what the heck is the church that's on?
but she's on a church. Yeah.
It's on a church. Yeah, it is.
I've seen them in
And it's
Ireland.
they're Romanesque churches most of the time.
Because
Yeah.
I've seen them on the walls of castles and churches.
Yes.
And,
Castles, churches, and walls.
and walls.
Town walls, because the figure was apotropaic. It was supposed to frighten you away. I guess the misogynist reading of that is a woman opening up her vagina would scare the bejesus out of whoever was, going to attack the town.
Some of the churchmen in the Middle Ages, it probably would have done. But then, of course, it's also associated in some ways with fertility. It's associated,
Of course.
It has become where some clerical men who are meant to be chaste and celibate might see it as terrifying. Yeah. Other people might go, yeah.
So my 2 anecdotes about my search for Sheela Na Gigs in Ireland, which was a long time ago, and I haven't been back to Ireland since. But the first is that my son, who was 9, and I explained to him what we were looking for, and he spotted one before I did on the wall, and he said, "Mom, that isn't what I think it is it?" I said, "Yes, it is." And he's like, "Oh no." And he got used to it, and then after that it was fine. He was, seeing them everywhere.
Right.
but his first reaction as a male was, "That isn't what I think it is." And he was 9, so.
Just to explain, and I will put a picture up in the video, but for those of you not familiar with a Sheela Na Gig, it is usually a primitive looking female form that is
quite grotesque and ugly.
Yeah.
Ugly. They're usually ugly.
And pulling open her vulva and, full entrance, legs apart. And that's why there's this association both with fertility, but also kind of that fear of sexuality. There are no teeth. It's not a vagina dentata, but it is very explicit.
Some of them, when the fingers are holding the vulva apart, the fingers actually look like teeth. They make spaces that look like teeth. I not all the time, but anyway. So the other anecdote about Sheela Na Gigs. So we were in a museum in some little town in Ireland. We were following the trail, looking for them wherever they were, and one of them was in a museum, and we went into the museum, and I just sat there for a little while. I was really interested in what the local people thought about this, and so 2 octogenarian little old white-haired ladies came into the room, and I thought, oh, they're going to be shocked at this. The 2 little octogenarians go up to the Sheela Na Gig, and it was out in the open. You could actually touch it. They went up to the Sheela Na Gig, and they started patting the vulva and stroking it. And one of them said to the other, she said, "Well, I guess we're too old for Sheela to do any good to us." And of course, they were referring to the fertility associations of Sheela Na Gigs. Some Sheela Na Gigs, their vulva area is well worn from people stroking it like these little old ladies did, to, I guess, consume the power of the Sheela Na Gigs fertility power, to themselves. They would touch it in.
Or as a talisman for let me get laid, or as a talisman, let it all go and work well as it's supposed to.
Yeah. No. I mean, these ladies were well beyond when they would probably be thinking about such things. And they joked about it. They joked about it. Yeah. And I just thought that was so funny. I was expecting something completely different, and they were fine with the Sheela Na Gig, and they were actually making jokes about it. So and
kind of like the Foliate Faces, the Sheela Na Gigs are often associated with pre-Christian or non-Christian belief
Yeah.
systems, and yet they're in Christian
Yeah,
structures.
and we don't really know why, and I don't think we'll ever know why. And some of them have been removed from wherever their original location was and been resituated in other contexts. So we don't know. I don't think we'll ever know firmly what their original purpose was,
Right.
because they've been repurposed and reassigned to different spots. And, you know, maybe the one in the church wasn't originally on a church, it was on some
Somewhere
other
else, and they
edifice.
nicked the
And
stone.
yeah,
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 because
yeah.
I was in when I did the castle tour, one of the daytime castle tours after the conference at Leeds, the International Medieval Conference at Leeds, and Kelly DeVries and Bob Wisdom Savage, we got to go to an actual royal castle. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it actually still belongs to King Charles. And we got a private tour of this castle, and on frieze work over the medieval gate, they're Sheela Na Gigs, and I've got photos of them, and they are quite clearly, there's more than one. They're kind of in
Yeah.
a line. And it's this fascinating image, and it's on a castle, and it's on a royal castle that is still a royal castle. It still belongs to King Charles.
And they're on they're on other castles in Ireland. We went to
This was
a
in England. This is
Oh, in
Yorkshire.
England, in
Yeah.
England. Oh, I thought you said okay.
Yeah.
No,
This
I'm
one was in
sorry.
England.
Yeah, I was thinking, jumping ahead in my mind. I saw one as far north in Britain as Orkney.
Oh,
The
wow.
the cathedral on in Kirkwall, which is the capital of Orkney, on the main island in Orkney. There is a Sheela Na Gig on a capital in that cathedral. So, you know, you don't expect them there.
Right.
Yet
Yeah.
there.
Well, and it's interesting
Yeah.
because, of course, this is assumption or association with certain things as England or Ireland or Wales or Scotland. I mean, Scotland, the Orkneys were populated by Scandinavians. I mean, that was
Yeah.
a Viking
Right.
outpost, and
Right.
you see similarities with that in Ireland too, because the
Yeah.
Scandinavians were everywhere in Ireland.
Yeah.
And when I did field work in Roslin Chapel, that was kind of part of the point, even though Roslin is a 15th century chapel. And there is potentially a Sheela Na Gig outside on the outside wall of but that's a lot of what's outside at Roslin has worn away. Possibly a Sheela Na Gig outside. And then there's foliate faces. There's over 100 foliate faces inside. But then there's imagery that evokes Yggdrasil and the dragon at the base of it. So
Yeah.
something like Roslin is really mixing all different
Right.
folkloric and
Right. Right.
mythological traditions
And
because that's the
we
heritage of
don't
the family.
we don't know to what extent these were created at the whim of the carvers,
Right.
who were told, fill up this space with carving.
Right. Just
And
do this.
they, yeah, just do this. Make sure you have a lot of
And they
interesting,
weren't all local people either. They
no,
were
no,
imported from
that's
all
right.
over.
So we don't know whether the carver himself chose to do these things, or, they were ordered to, or requested to do this by the person who was, the underwriter of the building. But so, we'll never know. And some of the faces in green, so-called green men, some of the faces were probably self-portraits of the carvers. They're
Kind
human
of like the
faces.
grotesques. Yeah.
Yeah, they're human face. I mean, a lot of the green men are very nicely, handsome human faces, and they may be self-portraits of the carver who is perpetuating himself in the stone, that he created, by
Right.
putting his own face there.
Because I mean, you see that in Oxford with the grotesques, and I mean, and they're not gargoyles. I say that
Yeah,
because people are sometimes conflate gargoyle and
yeah,
grotesque. Gargoyles are specifically meant to be rain gutters. That's the whole point.
yeah.
But the grotesques, you see them in Oxford, and they might be the face of your enemy, and you're carved
Hmm.
him in a nasty way. I mean, they were
Yeah,
commentary
yeah,
by the
yeah.
carvers.
I
Yeah.
mean, the carvers, had their own agendas
Yes,
sometimes.
and
Yeah.
you had to look, and it's this idea of my commentary and my satire is writ large on stone forever. That's the idea. So, I mean, what's your favorite one though? What's your favorite
Yeah.
either Sheila or your favorite foliate face?
Oh, I don't. I've seen so many. I don't. Oh no, I do have a favorite foliate face. There's a wonderful one in Norwich Cathedral, and I'll send you a picture of it. And you can give that to the. I can't
I can
describe it.
pop
It's
that
just
in the
gorgeous,
video.
and I
Yeah.
loved it so much that when I visited Norwich Cathedral, I there was in the gift shop a local artist was created. He carved replicas of some of the it was a roof boss in the cloister, and he did carvings of some of those bosses, replicas of them. And I couldn't buy the big one because it was too big to take home and it was too expensive, but I did buy a small one that I absolutely love, and it's hanging on my hallway that's full of green men, grotesques, and wild men and other things. I
I
have
know which one you mean because when I was in Norwich, I bought they had the cloth um Christmas ornaments. And
mhm.
the one I got, and I have them from the different cathedrals around England, and the one for Norwich is the Green Man boss. And it so I have that
Well,
one
there's
too.
more than one Green Man boss in
Right.
Norwich, so I'm not sure
Okay.
which one they made into the ornament. But this particular one, he's my favorite, and it's a very the face is so human and so handsome. Uh, it's just a beautiful, beautiful combination of nature and a really, really strikingly beautiful human being,
Right.
which is one of the reasons I love it. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Lorraine. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and all of the information you have on green men and wild men and Sheela Na Gigs. And I will post a list of your publications up on the various platforms. But I want to thank you so much for
And
this.
I'll send you some pictures that you can add to
Perfect.
the
Yes. So,
final product.
and
Okay.
I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this has been Medieval, Mischief, and Mayhem.